Okay, getting back to this, I accidentally hit pause end instead of pause. It seems like it's no real issue, so I'm not too concerned about that. I'd probably be curious about it though. The last one was about 20 minutes, 17, I believe. I'm gonna try to get this one to around the same time, and then end off it, and then technically part 4 will be over. I might work on part 5 some other day. I'm working like 2 parts per day I record. Okay. Where was I? Okay. The answer is that recession refers to a fall in real GDP, not simply being below it. Once real GDP stops falling, the recession is over, and the recovery or expansion, which is a rise in GDP, begins. During this period, economic activity, or GDP, increases until it hits its next peak. That happens when the next recession begins, and GDP starts falling again. The NBER cycle, the NBER Business Cycle Dating Committee determines that precise dates for each, looking backwards, no mortal, maybe even Leonard Cohen, can see the economic future. They briefly mentioned that you don't necessarily need to be going down to be in a recession, because just breaking even in our GDP, I already discussed how that's actually negative, because that means things are going. So while our economic health is still great, if GDP is stationary while factors are changing, that's usually a bad thing. My lips are purple now. Remember, pomegranate juice does that. Say a recession happens. GDP starts to fall as it did in late 2007 and continues to do so for some time, perhaps for 18 months into June 2009. Again, as with the most recent case, all that time, potential GDP is growing, so the gap is widening. Even if actual GDP begins to grow at 2.8% clip, at a 2.8% clip in 2009, it will immediately stop the gap from getting bigger. To close the gap, the actual GDP has to rise faster than potential. Same stuff. In the US, the average recession length in the 8 downturns since 1960 is about 11 months for a recession. Fortunately, recoveries last a good bit longer, close to 5.5 years on average. The bad news is that the actual GDP growth, though faster than trend, it's still sufficiently slow that it takes about all that time to get the economy back up to producing its potential GDP. Suppose, for an example, that the real potential GDP are both the real and potential GDP are both $15 trillion at the end of 2007, but that by early 2009, the GDP could potentially produce, if we employed all those seeking work and utilized all our plant and equipment to our capacity, had grown to 15.41 trillion, about 2% growth annually. Meanwhile, owing to the recession, actual GDP declined to $14.45 trillion. The GDP gap in early 2009 will then be 6.2%. Now suppose that potential GDP continues to rise at 2.2% for the conservative, while a recovery begins in which actual GDP rises at 3%. If these relative growth rate continues, it will take about 8 years for the economy to get back to its potential. A lot of jargon spat out. I'm actually studying with another buddy of mine on a different book, so I'm getting used to talking about this more. A lot of potential in real GDP getting spat out. Basically saying, At one point in time, we can meet the GDP, real GDP and potential GDP are equal. Adjusting, okay? So while this is slowly rising, I have to be careful not to do a certain hand motion at this. So recession occurs, so this one starts going on downwards, okay? Eventually, recession ends and it starts going up. It can't just continue as it is. There's still that massive gap, so it has to slowly but surely go back to its potential. Okay. Yes. Germany. Thanks for ruining that. That sounds bad. I'm referring to, I can't raise my hand to a certain level because of past angry German, technically Austrian. Not Germany as a whole. I have no ill will to Germany. Okay. Back to the 8 years they're talking about. That's a long time, especially for those who lose their jobs, which of course happens in a recession. When fewer goods or services are being produced, firms no longer need as many workers as before. Unemployment rises. People want to work but can't find jobs. Some of those who do find work, though not employed, are still underemployed relative to their skill levels. As when forming application designers or business executives find themselves flipping burgers or driving for Uber. And it's not just people either. Factories and plants are also underutilized and in some cases shut down. In short, a lot of productive resources go to waste, and a lot of valuable goods and services go unproduced. The big reason is why. Why do recessions happen, and why do recoveries take as long as they do to return the economy to its full potential? Why does the miracle of the invisible hand work to avoid waste and recession? Well, why doesn't the work of the invisible hand work to avoid the waste of recession? We're going to talk a lot about these issues and what the government can do to improve them in the chapters to come. We can preview the main focuses here, though. First and foremost, most recessions start with a drop in the amount of goods, consumer goods and new capital goods, that households and businesses want to buy. That is, most recessions start with a fall in aggregate demand. I'm going to just continue on. Hopefully it explains it. If not, I'll continue further. Note that a fall in demand doesn't have to lead to a fall in production. If workers take sufficiently deep wage cuts and firms make correspondingly large price cuts, the smaller amount of consumer and business spending will still buy a lot of output. That is, in fact, the automatic adjustment mechanism relied on by classical macroeconomists to keep the economy at its potential. For reasons not completely understood, though, this automatic adjustment doesn't seem to be strong enough in the short run. Wages and price reductions, or at least slow rates of wage and price increases, do not happen easily. Instead, a fall in demand translates into a fall in GDP and employment. And it is only after the rise in unemployment that the needed wage and price reductions seem to happen. Unfortunately, even then, these adjustments happen slowly enough that the time from initial downturn to a full recovery can be long. My throat's starting to hurt. I'll get back to this. It's also worth noting that sometimes the decline in GDP reflects a supply and not a demand shock. Think about an agricultural economy that produces just one good, say sugar or tobacco. If there is a serious drought, production will fall. So will employment and machinery of workers. There is no reason to employ harvesting machinery and laborers if there is no crop to harvest. Output will be down, employment will be up, and we will have recessionary conditions. But it's a supply-induced decline. No matter how much consumers and businesses want to spend, output cannot be increased. What it really amounts to is not a fall below potential GDP, but a temporary, we hope, reduction in the potential output itself. The OPEC price shocks in 1970s that made energy-intensive capital no longer usable may have had similar effect. For the most part, we focus on demand shocks. These likely reflect the bulk of the unusual movements we observe in the path of actual GDP. There are also kinds of shocks that macroeconomic policies can best address. Okay, I said I'd get to it. Section is over. I'm at this little tiny thing on page 49, so I'm going to talk about it. I realized that a lot of what they wrote just then seemed to be in order to understand it, you need to understand the supply and demand, how it works. If you do, skip the section. If you don't, I'm going to discuss about it. Helps me memorize. You all know the gist by now. Okay. Graph. Demand, supply. If supply is over here, but people only demand this much, okay? Supply can only produce price at around, their price would have to be extremely low because not many people really want it. Well, actually that's not. We have to assume that price has nothing to do, like how many people are willing to pay has nothing to do with this. So if production is this high, but they're selling it at this high also in demand, only a certain amount of people are willing to actually pay for that. So as it goes down and they're lowering prices, and the amount of demand stays the same, just the demand of how many people are willing to buy it at that price changes. Okay? So as supply increases, less people. As suppliers increase, there isn't as much competition. Well, there's more competition, so you have to lower prices. And because of that, a lot more people are going to buy it, but at the lower price. Hopefully I did a good enough job at explaining this. I recommend going to an actual video about supply and demand. I like to think this is more introductory. My models with my hands only isn't the best, but it's what I'm working with. I'm just constantly looking out the window because there's still the police cars there. I live in a safe neighborhood. Don't worry, this is entirely strange for me, which is why it's driving so much of my attention. Okay, now for the people who skipped here, I should mention again, I live in a safe neighborhood. Me constantly seeing these police cars is so weird for me, hence why I'm so distracted by it. It's entirely safe, don't worry. I'm in fact going to close the blinds, partially. So I'm not constantly looking at it. As I said, propped against the window. I'm just going to finish this next section, maybe discuss about it. It's about half a page. Unifying the field or not. Economists often are accused of suffering from physics envy, except when it comes to academic salaries. This is because economists want to develop theories that have same widespread explanations of economic events that physics can provide with natural phenomena. To put it mildly, economics is a long way from the point. Economists are trying to set like the basic foundations, like the Newton's laws for economics, but they just can't because you can't predict the economy as a whole. You can try, you can explain things, you can prescribe things to help, but you can't predict things. Unless you have the ability to see the future, you're kind of screwed. Well, you're not screwed, but you're just going to fail. But physics is not yet quite where it wants to be either. Notwithstanding the claims of some string theorists, physics is still looking for Einstein's unified field theory that will put quantum mechanics and general relativity together in one grand theory of everything. To some extent, macroeconomics has been plagued with the same problem in particular. It has been bifurcated between a long-run analysis in that can explain the features of the economy along its trend path. I'll repeat that again because I was stumbling around. It has been, I'm going to figure out that word, how to pronounce it. Because something tells me you guys already know it. And I don't. If not, I'll still explain it. Chromebook over here. Bifurcated. Volume up. That seems to be like bifurcate and bifurcated because it's with an ed at the end. It seems to be divided into two branches or forks. It has been, I'll replace the word, bifurcated or divided between long-run analysts that can explain the features of the economy along its trend path, and models of short run that capture the disequilibrium associated with recessions and unemployment. Basically saying we can't seem to agree on any sort of laws like physics has. Like physics, however, economists have recognized that traction of building one model that is capable of explaining both the short and long-term one unified. They want, essentially, I mentioned that physics doesn't have the ultimate equation for everything. It says that economists don't have it, but they also want it. Well, back to 17 minutes. So I'm going to end it here. Technically, this is between the two videos. It's the same length as any other part. So bye. I forgot. What's my channel name again? Like the worst study guide. It's stupid. I came up with it in like 2 seconds. Anyways.